Good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening. Thank you all for joining. And I know we have a great number of you joining us, which is fantastic, not only because it makes me personally happy, and my name is Elisabeth Braw, I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and it does make me very happy to have all of you with us. But what makes me even happier is to have three panelists, who I think are the reason that you're all joining, three panelists representing academia, international institutions, and the private sector. And together with them, I will discuss, and I hope you will discuss with us as well, the current state of artificial intelligence and the what one can call chaos of development, implementation, and getting some sort of order into this technology, because that's where we are today. It is being developed at an extremely high speed. It's being implemented and used in a very extensive fashion, not just in the West but around the world. But we don't really have a system for how to organize ourselves with AI, and so it's an area ripe for discussion. Not just ripe for discussion; it's urgent that we discuss it. And so I'm delighted to have the three panelists join me, and I hope that you will ask them as many questions as I will, because my questions are just the beginning of this conversation. And first of all, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Xiaolan, who is a professor at Oxford University and a fellow at Green Templeton College, my former college at Oxford. So I like you even more for that reason, Professor. But the reason you are on this call or this conversation primarily is your expertise in technology development. And for those who haven't read Professor Fu's bio, I'll just highlight a couple of things. She's the founding director of the Technology and Management Center for Development at Oxford, where she's also professor of technology and international development. And she is a member of the UN, United Nations 10-member high-level advisory group of the UN Technology Facilitation Mechanism. And she has also been involved with various other international bodies. And prior to coming to Oxford, she was at Cambridge. So I think we can agree that she has covered the pinnacle of academic achievement. I'm also joined by David Van Weel, who is the relatively recently appointed Assistant Secretary General at NATO for emerging security challenges, which means that he has to deal with all the thorniest issues confronting NATO, the ones where NATO really hasn't worked out what to do. So I think we all applaud you, and we'll be looking very closely, David, to see how you solve them, starting with AI within the next 60 minutes. And I'm particularly pleased that David is able to join us because NATO has, as we all know, just released its first ever AI strategy. And I should also mention that David is a Dutch diplomat by background, and prior to that, a Dutch naval officer. So a fantastic background from which to analyze where the world is heading security-wise when it comes to artificial intelligence, and what, if anything, international institutions like NATO can and should do in the area. And finally, the private sector is, of course, indispensable, because that's where the technology is being developed and also to a large extent implemented. And Jonathan Kewley is the co-head of the tech group at Clifford, which means that he advises a great number of private sector clients, companies, on issues relating to all manner of technology. But what is, of course, of specific interest to us in this next 60 minutes is artificial intelligence. And it's so incredibly important for the private sector, because the companies today are the front line of not just the development of the technology, but especially the implementation. And they are the ones seeing the results of maybe what we can call chaos, or at least insufficient order and standards when it comes to AI. So let me start with you, Professor. And before starting, I should say that everybody, please feel free to start thinking of questions, and you can email them to an email address will shortly come up on the screen to which you can email them, or better yet, you can post them on Twitter. And it feels like the American Enterprise Institute was set up to host AI events because the hashtag is AI at AEI. And so feel free to post them on Twitter, and Leila will keep scanning Twitter for your questions, but you can also email them to her. So with that in mind, I will start with you, Professor, and I'm really keen, I think we are all keen to understand the state of development of artificial intelligence today, what is happening, where it's being, what is being developed, what is being implemented, not just in the West, which I think we all know fairly well from our personal experience, but also in maybe less developed economies.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting panel. And good morning, also good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So artificial intelligence is one of the emerging technologies that is growing very fast across the world, and one of the core technologies in the current fourth industrial revolution. And it also has transformative power, and the transformative impact on the economy and the society. And looking at the progress across the globe in this field, we have to say the biggest AI economies and ecosystems are still largely based in the developed countries, especially the North America and also Europe. However, the landscape is changing. It's also changing with the developing countries catch up very fast, especially in Asia. Leading by China, followed by India. Of course, South Korea is also one of the major players based in Asia, although it's graduated from a developing country and moved to a developed country group just recently in the past year. So looking at China, as the AI development in the developed countries, have been quite well known by many of the experts attended today. So I give more focus on what's happening in the developing world. China is one of the key leading players in the developing world. And the recent studies, I think quite many, highlighted China's rise as an AI superpower. Looking at the AI patent and the AI publications, China is on the top of the world's ranking list, followed, either, in some of the indicators, it just follows the United States, and in some indicators, it even overtake the United States. For example, looking at the patent, AI patent, China ranks number 2, however, looking at the publications in deep learning and look at AI citations, in the past year, China has overtaken the United States. And also, China's AI development is not only, in the state-funded sector. It's more, very actively in the business sector. The Chinese companies, the privately owned, like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, they're all very active players in China. And India now is the world's, it's the second largest emerging market players in AI, with huge investments from the government and the private sector. And if we look at AI publications and patents, and India now ranks world's top 10, among world's top 10. So this is quite impressive, because looking at many other areas of scientific research, India falls far behind, but in AI, it's among the world top 10. And looking at other developing countries, overall, it lagged behind the developed country and also the kind of front runners in the developing country. But it has embraced some AI technologies and applications in Africa, South America, and also South Asia. So those applications mainly related to, in the agriculture sector, in healthcare, and also in public services. For example, even in Africa, in Rwanda and Brazil, we see machine learning using in agriculture, precision agriculture. And also in Nigeria, we see AI, big data have been used to identify fake drugs. And in the developing world, they're embracing artificial intelligence application. However, they are not very active in the innovation and the research and the development, not in the R&D, the creation part. It's more the diffusion and the adoption and application part. So looking at the world trend in AI, I have to be honest that I'm not a specialist technologist in AI. So looking at the literature, the next wave of AI technology advancement is expected to move towards emotional intelligence, using AI to analyze people's emotions, and also moving from machine learning, deep learning to sequential learning. So more kind of analytical kind of elements will be incorporated into AI development, And then where it has been used, actually, as we said, AI can have profound fundamental impact on our economy and our society. So it can be used for smart city, smart transportation, smart manufacturing, or smart marketing, more precision marketing promotion, and also in finance, education, healthcare, and also in defense. In the developing country, especially in China, like AI-powered applications are increasing very fast. They are used to customize to serve the needs in various sectors. From the smart city, now it's a popular hot topic, smart transportation, to smart manufacturing. So this is also a very hot area in China, and of course in finance, marketing, healthcare, education, we see various applications, developing very fast in China. That's a hot place. I think see very dynamic, active activities taking place in the application of AI. So AI offers opportunities and also challenges. If we look at for the developing country, now recently in the past 2 years, World Bank, United Nations both published reports on AI, emerging technology, frontier technology for the developing country. So they are embracing it now. Looking at the opportunity, many developing countries, will argue that they have the advantage in huge data because of the population. The big data can allow the machine learning to have more accurate, precise kind of solution and algorithm. And also, developing countries are also looking forward to participate in the AI global value chain. They can do something in the value chain, especially those kind of labor-intensive coding, labeling activities or data provision, or as a market for application. However, there are also challenges for the developing country. Actually, I'm also worried a lot. The developing countries will be lagged behind in this new race, technological race, or in this fourth industrial revolution, because it lacks the necessary skills, investment, and infrastructure. And also we see brain drains in AI scientists in the developing country, and also it has significant implications on income inequality within the country, within the developed country too, and also developing country, but also between countries. AI has such kind of potential, but if you don't have the skill, don't have the investment and infrastructure, you're just left behind. So we are likely to see the increasing digital divide, or the divide in AI between countries and across groups. And another very important challenge that we have to address, I think David will mention, is the AI application in defense. And we really need some global treaty to make sure we demilitarize and de-weaponize the application of artificial intelligence. So there are a lot of common grounds between countries. Europe, Jonathan will talk about, North America. And also, they are the three major leaders in the world in artificial intelligence. So based on this common interests and the common grounds, I think to collaborate, work together. Elisabeth, I think today's AEI's initiative is so great. I really like the title, collaboration, cooperation, put in the title. So work together to make sure AI used for good, to make good for the society and the community. And we need to take action. A dialogue is the first step, and make some set up the mechanisms to facilitate the dialogue, and even debates would be very important. Let me finish here. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll come back with questions, but you highlighted a number of crucial aspects there, ranging from the advent of emotional intelligence and how do we, what will the impact of that be on our societies. And I think that raises the point again that we need to organize ourselves to have some sort of framework for artificial intelligence, not just within countries but globally. And it occurred to me that when the internet arrived, which I think all of us on this call remember, it was a labor of love by an international group of engineers who wanted to create this international tool of communication, and they organized it in such a way that it would really be an international tool. AI is different because there is no sort of core of engineers that are doing it as a by nature or by default international system, but it's various groups and countries doing it individually. As a result, we are not as well set up with AI as we were with the internet, even though I realize that the comparison is not perfect, but nevertheless, there is less collaboration. And I know, David, you will hopefully be able to give some insights into how you think that might work. But I'll start with Jonathan. If you can describe the state of I don't want to say state of chaos, because we want to be a bit more upbeat here, but the state of AI as it's being implemented today, and the maybe challenges that the lack of international standards and cooperation results in the private sector and beyond.
Thanks so much, Elisabeth. And I guess if we're talking about this area and thinking about warnings, it's very clear that the technology is here now, so it's not in the future, and the laws aren't there to regulate it properly. And we've seen this happen before with data and the advent of the internet, as you said, and we're starting to see the consequences of that. And it feels like we're sleepwalking into another version, but a worse version of what's happened with technology regulation so far. And companies want to get this right. And as we know, the private sector, particularly in China and the US, have huge power. They're developing technologies which will influence the lives of us and our children for the rest of our lives. And so we have a pivotal moment here. I believe it's a very short window, and Eric Schmidt has written about that very recently in his new book. We should be treating this area with huge urgency to prevent chaos. I don't believe we have chaos yet, but it's coming if we don't act quickly. So I wanted in 5 minutes just to give you a brief whistle-stop tour, I guess, of what's happening in the world at the moment in terms of regulation of this space. And in its usual way, Europe is first out of the blocks on regulation in this space. So the proposal of a new AI Act that was published in draft in April 21, and it makes, I guess, 5 bold global statements about what it wants to do with AI regulation. And the EU is going big on this, in contrast to the US, and we'll come to that in a second. So it's got an extremely broad definition of AI. It basically captures any form of decision-making technology, any form of software that adopts what it calls statistical approaches. So it could be effectively anything, any form of very simple binary decision-making software that a business is using. So it goes broad. It's extraterritorial. So if there is technology in China or in the US, which is directed at EU citizens, this law will capture it. There are question marks about how that will be enforced, and I think that's been the case with GDPR as well. But again, very bold statement that the EU isn't prepared just to regulate this within its territory, it wants to go global. It looks at AI through the lens of risk, and it says that there are certain high-risk technologies, which we, in fact, in the advice that we provide, are already seeing a high risk. So, for example, HR, employee monitoring, employee selection. We're seeing a huge amount of new technologies and new businesses in this space now, using artificial intelligence to, for example, select people via their CVs, filter those CVs down, and then monitor employees and their activity, their productivity. Also, kind of, we're seeing biometric uses of AI, AI deployed in critical infrastructure. Now, the EU is saying this is extremely high risk and needs a risk management framework. And how it kind of looks at that, I guess, is through a life cycle. So why are you creating the AI? Who's exposed to it? What data is being used? Is that data good quality? Have you monitored your data sets? If the AI goes wrong, can you switch it off? Is there an element of human oversight to this, such that the AI isn't in control, a human can always step in? And again, for business, this will be exceptionally complicated to roll out and very expensive, and it will take a very long time. I mean, these laws are likely to come into play 23, 24, but businesses are already starting to prepare now. And lastly, the 5th pillar, I guess, fines 6% of global turnover if you get it wrong. So we're talking multiple billion-dollar fines if there's a problem here. So that's Europe being big, being bold, and in the same way that they did with GDPR, kind of leading the way, which is a good thing. We don't want to kind of just give the sense, though, that only Europe is being strong on this, because actually China is also increasingly being quite bold in terms of what it's saying about AI. So historically, there have been the Beijing Principles and the AI Ethics Code from the Ministry of Science and Technology. But in November, the 1st of November, the PIPL was published, and that has a whole section on automated decision-making. Concepts that I think everyone would support around transparency, around risk assessments of technology before it's launched, of giving individuals autonomy and rights over technology they're exposed to, so the ability to opt into use of automated decision-making, or indeed to opt out. So the kind of human volition, permission for use is a big an important part of China principles. And then also the right to object as an individual, again, individual autonomy to solely AI-based decisions. So China's actually going bold on this. It's also banned certain uses, say, for example, AI, which may result in price discrimination. So that's been very positively received, and I think is an extremely positive step forward in terms of the global debate. Interestingly, the US, I would say, is the furthest behind, and this is the area that troubles me most. So Obama in 2016 issued a paper on the future of AI. And to be honest, the US isn't really much further forward 5 years hence from then. So what the US says is that there is an existing structure that they can rely upon, that pre-existing laws are kind of good enough. And this is also echoed in countries like India. The US is saying, for example, that FTC rules on consumer protection, on unfair practice, on deceptive practices are all covered, and that can just be pivoted to AI use. They're very pro-innovation. The belief in the US is that if there are too many laws, it could stifle innovation. And there's a big debate to be had there, because as we've seen in a very highly regulated environment like the EU, technology companies have had less success than they have, say, in Silicon Valley. There is, I guess, a glimmer of hope in the US under Biden. And very recently in October, the Office for Science and Technology Policy issued a proposal for a tech bill of rights for individual human rights in this space. The issue for me here, though, is that this is about the rights of individuals. It's not actually about enforcement. And again, we've seen in the US that in areas of data and regulation of big tech, the US has been far behind. So as the test bed for a lot of technology and the location of huge amounts of innovation, the US from a legal perspective is probably from a world leader, superpower perspective, the furthest behind. And as I mentioned, countries like India is really interesting. And as we've heard, huge amounts of AI development there. Lawmakers there have said that they believe existing laws are sufficient, which to some may seem unusual because these new technologies are so new that how could laws have conceived of what they could do? So there's a definite mismatch there. And then lastly, UNESCO very recently announced its global standards in AI, its principles, 193 members. There was a lot of press around that recently, all very positive. But of course, those are voluntary and the US is not a signatory and there's no enforcement. And I think in this space, if we look at the private sector, if we're being honest, the fact that some technology has been built without the risk of repercussions, whether financial, criminal or other, is concerning. And when we have regulation and very clear regulatory structures, businesses, many of whom I act for, listen, they want to do the right thing, but they need direction. And if they don't have that direction from lawmakers, particularly in the US, it's a recipe for disaster, frankly. So you use the word chaos in the title. As I said, I don't think we're there yet, but we could get there unless laws globally pivot very quickly to this area and there's consistency of approach.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, disorder might have been a better word in the title, but I like the alliteration of chaos and cooperation. So chaos it was in the title. But thank you for that really quite extremely impressive whistle-stop tour. And I think you highlighted why exactly we have it's urgent to have legislative action, not just non-binding agreements, even though they are a fantastic start. But if they are non-binding, who will feel the need to implement them? And I just want to come back to one thing Professor Fu said earlier about the fact that developing countries have an advantage, as it were, in their large and growing populations and the opportunities that gives them in developing AI. And that's something I think the rest of us should think about. And I'm not really sure what sort of conclusions we should draw from it, but it's definitely a departure from the usual setup in technology where we the West, the developed world are always far ahead, and developing countries pick up the crumbs as they go along. This could be very different. And with that, I want to turn the floor over to David. Defense has come up a number of times, and the need for some sort of international order. I'm not expecting you to establish that international order in 10 minutes or so, but I hope you can give us an overview of how you see NATO and NATO's role and how NATO's AI strategy fits into all of this.
Yeah, thanks. And okay, I won't reach any conclusions in 10 minutes, but I can set a goal for working towards order. So AI is a foundational technology, and it's a pervasive technology. It's going to have an impact on everything we do. In the economy, it's going to have impact on our communication. It's going to have impact on our information domain. And yes, it's also going to have impact in the defense domain. So the idea that AI would not be used for defense purposes is like saying that the steam engine, when it was invented, could only be used for commercial purposes, or electricity would not be supplied to the military. AI is all around us, and therefore it will be playing a large part also in the military realm. Now, the question is, how do we deal with that? Because not all use of AI is controversial. If I tell you that we have an 1100% more efficient imagery analysis of airfields due to the use of AI, probably you wouldn't object to that. Or if I say that we have a better use of weak signals in the hybrid domain by using AI scanning tools and data, that doesn't sound controversial. So what I want to get away from is the discussion that if we talk about AI, that we're talking about autonomous weapon systems that make their own decisions in killing people. The killer robot discussion. That is not what AI is about in the largest extent, although I will come back to those specific means. Now, I have an issue with all of my dossiers, which is called emerging security challenges. And that is that we are always late to the party. So when I joined the Navy in 1994, we would have a more accurate GPS signal because GPS was developed by the military. So it went for most technologies. We discussed the internet, but even the email came originally from a defense application. So governments back up until the 70s were spending a lot of money on R&D, and a lot of the technological innovations came out of those initial endeavors of the governments into investing in foundational technology. That is no longer the case, and the two other speakers have alluded to that. Technology and innovation now comes out of the private sector mostly. It's being funded mostly by the private sector. It's being developed to have a commercial use, and then maybe a dual use case later on in the process. And that might sound like a good thing, but it has its limitations and its flaws, because it means that governments, but also the defense sector, is always late to seeing what the potential impact of technology is. If you do not master it, if you are not there where the technology is being developed, and those developing it are not looking at the security impacts of their technology that might be, then you risk ending up in a situation where regulation comes after the broad use and misuse of technology. And I would say that in big tech, we have seen examples of this misuse and under-regulation just because governments weren't able to grasp the full impact of the technologies, what the impact will be on the information sphere, what the impact will be on our democratic processes, what the impact will be in the security domain. So we need to be early to that party and make sure that we understand new technology as they come up. Not to militarize them, no, but to understand the security and defense implications of those technologies before you start regulating. And there I would agree on the EU that they are far ahead when it comes down to thinking about regulating AI. But what they don't take into account is the security and defense aspects and uses of AI, for example. And that is a miss from two angles. One, you don't want the security and defense realms not to be regulated, which is what the current EU legislation proposes, is to leave an exempt category for all national security and defense cases. Second, you don't want to over-regulate if you don't know that you can defend yourself within the regulations that you're proposing. So you need to have this angle to those new technologies being fed into the general regulation debate. And let me give you an example on autonomy. So at the moment, if we want to catch drones with explosives, and you know drones are very cheap and easy to buy, then the ways to catch them are quite primitive. So you either jam the signal and run the risk that you jam an airfield, which might be the objective of the attacker in any case, or the drone might return home, or you use a net to catch a drone. Now that's all fine. Now we get drone swarms. So we get hundreds of drones that collectively, powered by AI, are able to follow an intrinsic pattern of attack on, for example, our water supply or one of our cities. So how do we defend against that? Well, we can't, frankly, because you need AI in that case in order to be able to counter AI. So it's all these kinds of questions. That means that we need to be in that discussion and shaping it. Now, in doing so, we have to bridge a gap of distrust. So I've been on panels quite a lot where people say, well, please, I don't trust the defense use of artificial intelligence. And that's something we need to address. We are a trusted user. We, NATO, all the 30 allies, we all subscribe to the democratic values, and we all subscribe to the same values that our societies are built upon, and we're there to protect them. So in using AI, in developing AI, we have to ensure and make clear to both the private sector and to our societies that we are a trusted user of artificial intelligence, that we intend to use AI by the standards that we adhere to all our weapon systems and the use of force in defending ourselves. And that's why the AI strategy that we just devised came up. And that's why we made it public to a large extent. We are not known at NATO for publishing a lot. We try to keep secrets a lot. In this case, I really advocated that is kind of against the whole purpose of having this AI strategy. The purpose of this AI strategy is to gain a better understanding of what's out there, to prove that we are willing to engage with this innovative new ecosystems in order to look at the defense purposes of AI, also look at the threats of the misuse of AI by adversaries, making sure that certain technology doesn't leak away to those who might not adhere to the same standards that we have, and then developing this all in a responsible way. So we've adopted 6 principles of responsible use. I'll just read them out here. They're lawfulness, responsibility and accountability, explainability and traceability, reliability, governability, and bias mitigation. So all 30 NATO nations have signed up, including the US, I would say to Jonathan, to having any use of AI in the defense or security purpose adhere to these 6 principles. And principles are nice, but they need to be verifiable as well. And they need to be baked in from the moment of the first conception of an idea up until the delivery. And that's where we will have a new initiative launched, where we have test centers across the alliance, based in alongside universities, existing test centers with knowledge, where allies that are thinking about co-developing AI for use in the defense sector can come in and verify with protocols, with certain standards that we're setting, that this AI is actually verified. It's not a world standard yet, but if 30 nations, Western democracies, start out by shaping industry to adhere by these standards, then I feel that we are making an impact, at least in the development of AI, and hopefully also in the larger world-setting standards. So we're trying to contribute to a better world, but we need to be part of the game in order to be able to do so.
Wow, so many aspects that to continue discussing, and well, you gave an excellent overview, and also I'm grateful that you highlighted some of the positive steps are being taken, and also some of the positive uses of AI, because it's easy to descend into a very discussion dominated by hopelessness, since we're not really sure what this technology is doing. And on that note, a number of questions have come in highlighting or pointing out that it's difficult to regulate AI, since there is no agreed definition of what it even is, or what constitutes the technology. So on that note, I want to start going through some of the questions, and thank you, because it really, we have a number of fantastic questions already. And so I'll pose the first couple of questions, I think, to Jonathan and Professor Fu. So the first one is, there is a push towards regulation of the use of AI, but so far the talk is all the talk is around so far, all the talk around is merely speculation. So what are the foundations or principles are being used or should be used to begin to understand how to deal with AI and its fast-paced development? And the second question along the same lines, can we stop talking about AI regulation when no one can define what AI is and who's using it? Instead, let's look at data governance, IT procurement rules, data protection, free flow of data, and misuse of any software. So I don't know if you want to start, Professor, and then Jonathan, or vice versa.
I'm happy to start, or Professor.
Okay, Jonathan.
So for me, this is actually really simple, which is, if technology is being used in the private sector or in the defence sector or by governments, and there is discomfort about the impact of that technology on individuals, whether that's large groups of individuals or small groups of individuals, then businesses, organisations, and those companies developing the technologies or government developing the technologies should stop. Right? They should pause and reflect. And we only get that by transparency, understanding what the end result could be, and understanding where this technology goes wrong. And I think the first question was sort of focusing on, where's the rubber on the road? What are organisations doing around this? And I think a lot of the focus of the law now is on just this. It's taking it out of the secret world that David mentioned and making this public, telling the public much more about how you're using AI, being very clear, being very simple. And I think organisations increasingly will be asked to do that. I mean, there are existing laws both in the US and in Europe and in China that require transparency to the public. They're here now. And so businesses must start to do this more. And I think enforcement will help, but that doesn't happen. And that will mean that the public consciousness will be much higher. The public will then start to ask questions of their government and of companies. And I think they'll vote with their feet. I mean, we're starting to see, it's very interesting to see in recent months what's happening around Facebook. We had the first wave around Cambridge Analytica, which was an algorithm going wrong. And now we're seeing a second wave around, alleged exploitation and impact on vulnerable groups like teenagers. And the public consciousness suddenly, I think, in the last 12 months is so much higher around these concepts. Businesses are starting to care, but the way in which we get this to really change from being theoretical to real is for companies to be very honest and for governments to be very honest with the public, tell them the truth, and then the public will react. And if they don't like it, you should adjust your technology.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Go ahead.
I think the ethical issues of AI is a very important aspect that we need to pay attention to. It was in my notes for my first question. I forgot to mention, but I want to bring it back. I think the risks and the ethical issues is very important. So thanks for the two questions, and I think they are important. What are the principles, and about the regulations? I think it's very important for us to have the bottom line. All the countries, we as human beings across the globe need to agree some bottom line about the AI development and its application. It has to be people-centered. We have to protect people. I think instead of AI or machine or owner of the algorithm, I think to protect the people is very important, and also sustainability about its coherence, about a sustainable development, about its interaction about with climate change, and also about an inclusive society to make nobody left behind. In addition to this, about protect the welfare and data privacy of the people. These are just some examples, but I think the world can sit together and discuss some bottom line. That bottom line the AI has a lot of potential, a lot of impact, which at the current moment we cannot foresee. Even not at the moment, we cannot see all the potentials. However, some of the bottom line which we should not allow to happen, or some basic principles we should stick. And I think at this moment, all the people can sit together and discuss all the principles. UNESCO's what Jonathan mentioned, its 10 recommendations on ethical issues of AI. It's a very good step forward. When it mentions about protect data, it has 4 principles. I think protecting data, banning social scoring, mass surveillance, helping to monitor and evaluate, protecting the environment. That's the UNESCO's some of the recommendations. And I think we can based on this, develop more on the principles and about the data flow. Also to agree about the ownership of the data. Who owns the data? Of course, different stakeholders will have different arguments. Whether the people who create the data owns the data, or the company who provides the platform for people to use owns the data. We can have a debate and have a dialogue and agree. I think those kind of fundamentals we need to agree on, no matter in which country, what kind of political system. Some of the principles, I think we can agree some consensus.
And I couldn't agree more. And I think obviously there are geopolitical divides forming, and we know that, but we should be really careful to kind of, for this multilateral dialogue not to be blocked or barred by those geopolitical tensions. And in particular, protection of minority groups, the elderly, the young, those with disabilities. It shouldn't matter which country you're in the world, you should be able to agree on that. But not just agree in principle, enforcement, global enforcement, countries coming together to enforce these principles is also really important.
A technical question for you, Professor, and then I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about it, and in the meantime I'll bring in David. But the question is, if we look at the consumer awareness among Western consumers that Jonathan mentioned, it seems to lead to a more vocal opposition to AI, or at least to people don't want to be they don't want AI to be tested on them. They want they want freedom from AI. They certainly want to enjoy the benefits of AI. I think in many cases they just don't want it to be tested on them. And so the question is, do you see a development where AI will be tested on populations in developing countries simply because of this Western reluctance among Western consumers to be test objects, as it were, and what do you make of such a development? And I will also bring in David now, because, and I'll come back to you, Professor. I'll bring in David because a number of questions relating to your comments. So I'll highlight 2 here. Many argue that AI will revolutionize military operations, but this raises many legal, ethical, and moral issues on how far we can or will allow AI into our decision-making process, particular decisions on when to fire. Do you think we have necessary institutional frameworks at hand to address these issues, as we will need to include private business in the discussion? And if not, do you have any proposals on how to address these issues? And Jonathan, feel free to come in as well. And then the second question for you, David, the idea of a global treaty to de-weaponize or demilitarize the application of artificial intelligence. Could someone elaborate on why or what might happen absent one? So a couple of meaty subjects for you, David, to explore in a few minutes, and as ever, those who are burning to ask, dying to ask questions, this is your last chance with the hashtag AI@AEI or email Leila Hernando.
Thanks, and some really big questions, and I can only start with a tip of the iceberg of answering them. So having new technologies into armed forces and then being confronted with ethical or moral dilemmas in using those new technologies is nothing new to the military. So whether it was the use of gas in the First World War, or the first time that cannons were used, or nuclear weapons, to name a very big ethical and moral dilemma, that's nothing new. So yes, I think we're really well equipped in looking at a certain technology, then applying our own moral and ethical rules or thinking frame to new technologies in order to decide what we find acceptable use and what we find irresponsible or unwanting use. And that is something that's ingrained into the NATO fibers, which is we are democracies that use force only when needed to defend ourselves, and we want to do so in a moral way and with having as little collateral damage as we can. So from our side, I'm not too worried about the philosophical part of ethical constraint. When it comes down to practically implementing it, I already mentioned that the lofty principles is only the start. How do you operationalize them into something which is basically coding software, which AI for the time being still is? And what is the quality of the data that you feed into that algorithm? Because that will determine the reliability, the accountability, the bias mitigation. That will really determine whether the outcome applies to your principles. And that's what I said where the test centers come in. So we want to be co-located with the best universities in our territory in order to be able to have this open co-design process where we have verifiable ethical use of AI, so to speak. Now, the second question was on de-weaponizing AI. And my question always is, well, what does that mean then? Because at the moment, a lot of flying an F-35 or in how your information is being presented to the pilot uses algorithms, uses artificial intelligence. Just because in the modern information environment, it is impossible not to use algorithms or AI to enhance your operational awareness. Every camera that you have in your iPhone uses algorithms and artificial intelligence in order to perform duties before you press the button. So we don't have transparency into what our software in our life around us does in any case. Does it then matter whether it's in an F-35 or whether it's in your car at home? That depends how many people you kill with either your car or your F-35. And in that case, I would say that important is that the use of force in a defense context must always be deliberate, and it must have a human-machine interaction that allows you to make the right decisions. So at this time, it sounds very plausible to say we cannot have any weapon systems using AI to enhance the decision-making process. And I would agree at this point, because the data, both the data as the AI, is very preliminary. It's very rudimental. It is by no means capable of making such important decisions, especially not by its own. But if in 10 years we are able to use artificial intelligence in order to ostensibly decrease the number of collateral damage in military operations because of enhanced awareness and better decision making, or by an algorithm that when the human presses fire says, well, sorry, I wouldn't do it because I've just spotted something that reminds me of, thereby preventing unnecessary loss of life. Do we really now want to eliminate potential positive uses of AI for defense uses? There, I would say, please hold on and look at the specifics of the technology at hand and the ethical use that you want to have it use in now. And let it be an open dialogue. As I said, I'm trying to have this dialogue as open as we can, so we can together as societies and governments come to an acceptable agreement on those issues.
No, I think, Elisabeth, the question was also partly what happens if we don't get this treaty, and I agree that it's urgently needed. AI doesn't have ethics, It doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't have a moral fibre unless it's programmed in. And particularly in defence, the equivalent that I think of is kind of a nuclear weapon, and you effectively have to press a button, and there's a person behind that. AI has the risk to be as toxic as a nuclear weapon, if not more. And if we don't have the equivalent of that moral compass, the finger on the button, designed in through a treaty, because we're not going to design the technology to prevent this unless there's a treaty involving China, US, and others, we're going to have a similar issue to nuclear risk. And we do need to think about it in that context. We need to have that conversation now.
Thank you, Jonathan. And David, your point about AI-aided consumer technology ranging from cars to phones having risks as well that we as consumers don't even think about because we are so busy thinking about how AI could, what was a risk it could pose in a military context. I think that's a very relevant point. And I think everybody is familiar with the cases where a self-driving car has had various accidents and in a couple of cases caused a human injury and even loss of life. Professor, I want to come back to you regarding developing countries and them being used as laboratories.
I think I have 4 points. Let me go quickly. First, many countries are now strengthening their regulation on the use of artificial intelligence, etc. So I think openness, transparency is a fundamental principle. We have to stick to this. We have to make this clear to the users, the consumers, whether they agree what's this for and what's the impact on them, and whether they agree or not. Yeah. Secondly, even in the Western countries, we now pay a lot of attention to ethics. Even in Oxford, even we are doing research using data in other countries, developing countries, including, we have to go through very careful ethical assessment, very long forms and the reviews and the revisions, and really make us to reflect on what's the implications on the users, even they're in Africa or in South America. So in Western countries, they're also paying more attention to protect the user, no matter which country they are. Thirdly, I think there are some cultural difference we have to admit. There was the CEO of Baidu in China made a statement saying that the Chinese consumers are more open and receptive to using digital technology. That was a huge backlash, but overall, there are some cultural differences among the society, among the consumers in their kind of acceptance to some new things or digital technology. Finally, I think we have to watch out some multinational companies to use institutional voids to test their AI. I think that's like the environmental technology. Some of the multinationals relocate to the developing countries looking for institutional voids. For AI, there may be also such kind of cases. And I think the global community and the governments need to be very vigilant and watch this out to prevent this through more strengthening the regulation and the laws. Thank you. So that's my 4 points.
Thank you very much, and you finished with perfect timing because we have 1.5 minutes left, which gives me time to say that AEI has just published a report on AI, specifically on this subject of the prospect of international cooperation and the risks if we don't achieve at least the rudimentary level of international cooperation. It was published this morning and will be sent out to you after the event. And I just want to give David and Jonathan 30 seconds each to add maybe the points that all of us, me and the other participants, have forgotten to ask about. So starting with you, Jonathan.
I suppose my closing point is about making this all human-centered. And what does ethics mean? It means putting the human at the heart of technology. And what we've seen in other areas so far, and we've got good precedents, is that if you take the human out and you just go over a profit motive, or in the defence sector, a kind of a kill motive, then you've got a real issue. So putting morality, human beings at the heart of this will ensure that we don't have chaos, because that moral compass will be there, and we all have a part to play in this. And finally, I would say that multilateralism is so important. We can't have this debate on our own in Europe and not include China and not include the US. It needs to be a big conversation, a global conversation, and a non-exclusive one.
David, the final word goes to you.
Well, thank you for the honor, and thank you for the discussion to all of you. I would say that at the heart of this is ethical use of technology, irrespective of which technology it is. And we have a big challenge here with AI as opposed to nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are difficult to make. They're easy to be verifiable under a regime, whereas here we're talking about a bit of software, where it's very difficult to see where the producer or the producing nation has integrated their ethics into these systems. So it'll be a difficult debate, but if we focus on the ethical use, then I think we will get there.
Thank you. And we'll come back to this discussion, this subject, no doubt, especially since AI at AEI is the perfect hashtag. So we'll here at AEI, we'll host another conversation like this, no doubt, in the very near future. And with that, thank you to Professor Fu, to David, to Jonathan, and to all of you. And we'll see you again soon.